Hello, everyone, and welcome to Death for Beginners. I know, what an incredibly cheery subject for a webinar, but it can be more important as we stutter and struggle to deal with bereavement in the workplace. Often colleagues can't broach the subject, managers are at a loss of what to say, and employers are ill-equipped to deal with death in the workplace. So we're here to change that. First of all, I want to extend a massive thank you to everyone that's joining us here. Thank you. It's so nice to actually see people wanting to learn more about the subject and become more empathetic as a workplace. It's really important to see. And that's why we're hosting this webinar, because we feel like this is a topic that we want to talk about more. It's a taboo we want to break down. So thank you for joining us. If you do have any questions at all during the webinar, please ask away in the Q&A tab, which should be on your Zoom. This webinar is being recorded and may contain some sensitive subjects and topics. If you do want to take a break at any time, please feel free to do so. You're more than welcome to do that. And if you don't want to ask a question, that's absolutely fine as well. I am an absolute novice on death and grief, but thankfully for you, I'm joined by two panelists that can help shine a light on this hard to talk about subject. My first panelist is Evie Little. Hi, Evie. Customer Success Manager at Seniorcare by Lottie. After working with many organisations on their employee engagement for years, Evie's role has evolved to make elder care and later living one of the most integral benefits in the UK. At Seniorcare by Lottie, Evie is there to help partners understand more about later living and ensure that employees and employers are well prepared for everything that encompasses it. Welcome, Evie.
Thank you. Thanks.
And my second panelist is Anne Wadey. Hi, Anne.
Hi.
Hi. Anne is from the National Bereavement Service. Towards the start of her career, Anne was asked to cover NHS acute hospital bereavement posts on a temporary basis. Well, temporary soon became 35 plus years of experience. So I couldn't think of anyone better to navigate the nuances of this topic and equip us all with the knowledge and emotional resilience around the universal experience of the death of someone we care about. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. So I'll start at the very top. Sue Ryder publication found that 51% of people would be scared of saying the wrong thing to someone who was recently bereaved. We're never going to get it right. There are so many different ways of saying it: passing away, losing someone. Someone even sent me an article yesterday referencing the demise of someone, which seems a bit strong. What are the best possible ways of mentioning someone has passed away or died, Anne?
Okay, well, I must admit that I usually use died, but then I've had all that practice at doing it.
Yeah.
What I can say is that nobody has ever, in my entire career, complained about me using it. I have made other mistakes along the way, but that isn't one thing that's upset people. Passed away, I think, is so universal that I've given up battling against it, even with our teams. But I would question, if you're talking with somebody where English isn't their first language, whether that would have meaning for them. And I think everybody knows what's happened. What I would do is also listen to the person you're talking to. Listening is always more important than saying in bereavement. And so what language are they using? The one time I would be very careful about using lost is if a child has died, even if it's an adult child of an adult parent, because as parents, we feel a responsibility towards our children, and parents inevitably feel more guilt than the usual guilt that's part of grief, and therefore may well feel that they have failed in their task as a parent if their child has died before them. That's changed around the natural order. Yeah. And of course, with some parents, just occasionally, it may be that a moment's inattention has led to tragedy, which you may not know. So it could be that there's something, they haven't just lost their child on the supermarket or on the beach. It could be much worse than that. Some parents will use it themselves, in which case fine, but others find it very, very upsetting.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to if you lose someone close to you, someone you care about, however you mention it, is the right way to mention it as it's your own personal perspective, or do you have to be sort of sensitive to other people when
I,
you talk
I
about
think
something?
I would always say usually something actually quite neutral. So I'm really sorry to hear your sad news,
Mm,
because it is something that's new to me. I've only just heard about it,
yeah,
which gives somebody the option of where they want to pitch the conversation. Or if it's somebody I'm talking to on a phone call or a meeting, I'm sorry to meet you in these circumstances. I'm sorry about the circumstances that have led to our conversation today. Because as a professional, particularly if it's not my bereavement, I'm not the person who's died isn't personally known to me,
mm,
then I want to keep the conversation empathetic in its language, but quite neutral in its tone. Because depending on the nature of the contact we're having, I could push somebody into being emotional in a context that's not helpful. And also it could seem quite false.
yes,
If I'm, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about, but it's not somebody I've known, that's not authentic.
yeah.
And I
So
think I was really sorry to hear about that. How are you doing? Now, that's can be a, well, how do you think? But people, again, it's just an opening for them.
yeah, exactly, and I completely get that using neutral language to start everything off is perhaps the best way to begin thinking about approaching bereavement in the
And I
workplace.
think what the most important thing is actually a step back from that is to acknowledge what has happened. Don't go into a conversation completely ignoring it, because
Yeah,
that leaves somebody feeling, well, do they know? Don't they? Do I need to tell them? Oh, it's so exhausting having to tell everybody about what's happened. So they don't know where they are. So the acknowledgement that something really life-changing for the person who's bereaved, not obviously the life of the person who's died has ended, is really important. And that's the key.
yeah, I agree totally. And Evie, on the flip side, when it comes to organizations, why is death important to talk about for organizations?
Yeah. So I think, well, most people will experience death of somebody they know at some point during their working lives. I think in the last 12 months alone, it was around 24% of working age people, which equates, I think, to like 7.9 million have experienced bereavement.
Yeah,
So I think employees are often like unable to get the time off they need. And I think, as Anne was just saying, like a lot of people tend to suffer in silence as well, or without the support they need, or again, as Anne was saying, like with the acknowledgement of those around them. And obviously it's not only does this impact like the ability to process their grief, but also it has an impact on their work. So I think as an employer, it's crucial that you provide, like, I guess, open, supportive, and I guess like flexible working environment as well for those that are going through that grief too.
yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially when you're talking about millions upon millions of workers like in the
Yeah.
last year. It's a crazy number to think.
And if I can chip in there, Robin,
Yes,
I
please,
think
Anne.
one of the things is that research has shown that it impacts hugely on people's loyalty to the company.
Mm.
Mm,
If people don't receive what they perceive as supportive care after the death of somebody close to them, their inclination to jump ship the first time another job opportunity comes up increases enormously.
Mm.
yeah.
I mean, what a waste of resource, just for a little bit of effort on our part as employers.
Mm.
Absolutely. What that bit of empathy can do, the power of that supportive nature can do with the sort of cohabitation of your workforce, getting everyone working together and being open with one another couldn't be more important. I completely agree. When we're looking, we've touched a bit on the first steps that people should think about and take. when being part of an HR team or manager. But and how can grief be different person to person? I think that's a kind of an
Okay. I
start.
think the first thing to start off is that it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But we all experience lots of things in common. So there is, it's still possible to find lists that are like tick boxes of how you grieve properly.
Yeah.
If you come across one of those, please throw it away. It is not such a neat and orderly process. It's very chaotic. The emotions can be incredibly intense and overwhelming, and sometimes quite surprising. It can be really quite shocking to somebody to find that they're actually feeling very angry with the person who's died. You know, maybe they were in the middle of moving a house, or they find that there's a debt they didn't know about, all sorts of things, or they just feel abandoned. And why did they go? Why did they have to leave them? It's not logical, but it is real, and it's important to acknowledge, and it is entirely normal. So there's a huge range of emotions. Some days people can't even manage to get out of bed, let alone get themselves proper food. And it goes on for much, much longer. So people may well have got back to work and be normal on the surface, but how hard they're paddling under the water is really phenomenal. And they're quite fragile. And that could easily be for a year, or in some people actually say the second year is worse, because they've got through the anniversaries, the first time, the first Christmas, the first anniversary of the death, the first birthday, but the person still isn't there.
Yeah.
And everyone else has kind of forgotten, because everyone else has got used to your new normal, but the bereaved person hasn't. Grief doesn't ever go away completely.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because actually, when you're trying to understand grief, you understand it as this shock, don't you? This tremor that has affected someone's life. Where actually understanding grief is actually more of a journey. It's actually more of a elongated period. So understanding that in the first place seems like a good step for people. And then you talk about acknowledgement a lot. Acknowledgement is obviously a very important part of this process, but who should know versus who shouldn't in the workplace when it comes to bereavement?
That's down to the bereaved person.
Yeah.
And therefore, I would hope that a manager, supervisor, at whatever level, would have that conversation with the bereaved person before they return to work. Now, in some cases where a firm is very local and everybody knows everyone else in the village, in the next village, or whatever, and certainly we've done training at a company that we were told there are no secrets because they're very geographically based and everyone knows everyone else. People will know. But it's still important to have the conversation as to how the bereaved person wants people to react. For some people, they will ask that everybody just carries on as if it hasn't happened. They know that people know, but they also know that they want to come in and just sit down at the desk and have that distraction of working without being reminded all the time. So some people will say, actually, I genuinely don't want people to know. It may be that somebody has had a major loss of a relationship that wasn't known to people in the workplace and should remain unknown to people in the workplace, given what office rumour and gossip can do sometimes.
So is that a conversation, sorry to jump in, is that a conversation that, managers or HR teams should be initially having?
Yes.
Who would you like to know? If you
and
do
how would you like them to be told?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's a really, I think that's a really nice, important step for any manager to have in mind, because that starts the open communication, doesn't it?
Exactly. And it demonstrates, actually, we care and we want to make this right for you. What's the best way of dealing with this for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sets a tone.
I love that. Okay. And then how can assumptions, we've got number 3 on the slide there, it says being mindful of different cultures. How can assumptions of bereavement be damaging to someone?
Well, let me give you an example. I was in Central Africa when my father died, but because of the pre-internet communications, I only discovered he'd died a week after. The day that he died, I discovered he'd gone into a hospice. And one of my colleagues sort of said, "Oh, Anne, it'll be so good if you get back in time to see him." And because I had a very ambivalent relationship with him, I wasn't that fussed about seeing him. And I thought, I'm going to be confused because I won't know whether I'm being a nurse or I'm being a daughter, which is actually more difficult. So she made an assumption based on her perception of the world of how I should be feeling, and she was wrong. And it's very easy, if we have been bereaved ourselves, to then project our experience onto other people. And we're not all the same. I mean, each of us, even with the same person who's died, all the people around them will have a different experience of grief because they will have had unique relationships with that individual. And, you know, we've got cultures on the slide. I learned through working in central West London an awful lot about particularly the Jewish faith and their immediately after death customs, and Islamic people, but there are still variations within that. With Muslim deaths, the first question I used to ask would be, are you having the burial here or are you flying overseas? Because that was a frequent choice. It was a very practical question. And but the question in itself, I then had somebody trying to say, oh, well, we're in a hurry. And his companion said to him, be quiet. She clearly knows exactly what we want, and she's trying to do her best to get on with it. At which point I could go and get them to go to the cafe, have a cup of tea while I got things organized for them. So, but at the end of the day, we need to ask people, you know, is there anything related to your culture, if it's not our own, that we should know about, that we need to be helpful about? So it may be that with some religions, there is a particular anniversary day that is very important that people will need time off for. That sort of thing.
So being mindful of that as well, obviously will help. People's face lie, but then also alluding to your story, understanding that everyone is completely different and has a different sort of experience of bereavement. I feel even just understanding that is a really important place to start.
Definitely.
What is, if I came to you, Anne, and you were working as part of an HR team, and I said that someone close to me has died, what would be the first thing you'd do and say to me?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
The first thing. And then I would encourage you to tell me a little bit about your relationship with the person, particularly if you are going to be the person who has to take responsibility for all the practical things that have to be done. Because, and the nature of the relationship. You know, a lot of us have policies that say you can have 2 days if it's an uncle and 5 days if it's a parent and all the rest of it. And obviously there's now the statutory 2 weeks if it's a child under the age of 18. But we don't all get brought up by our biological parents or even step parents. Some of us are brought up by aunts and uncles, grandparents, or people to whom we're not formally related. Maybe a foster carer, an informal foster carer. So what I really want to know is, how are you impacted by this death? Not based on a genealogy chart, but actually in terms of the real relationship you had with them. And then we look at what you might need and time off, other support on the basis of that.
Yeah, so that's the first place, just to ascertain the relationship you have. before making any, like we said, assumptions or pre-acknowledgements or any projections. Just find out a bit more about that.
Yeah.
Cool. That seems like a good place to start to me. For this next section, moving on to, we're going back to language a bit. We thought about, things what not to say, because these are very common, and you can type these into Google infinitely and they come back with the same things, which leads me to think that these are unusually common. And I assume people are meaning well by these, but actually they're probably unhelpful and quite insensitive in a way. Wouldn't you say, Anne? What do you think of these?
I'm glad you put them in red, because they are absolute red flags. I think people do mean well.
Yeah.
But you just need to let go. It's all part of God's plan. Again, we are imposing our beliefs on someone else. And there are circumstances that and I'm a practicing Christian who is in church most Sundays and other events, but I would find it very offensive for someone to say to me that it's part of God's plan.
Again, that's an assumption, isn't it?
It's absolutely an assumption. And even if it was true, actually, it's not helpful.
No.
So I don't think we're not here for a theological debate.
No, I don't think we are. And the one I dislike probably quite a lot there, at least they're not in pain anymore, is very sort of, that strikes me as quite insensitive, because that's almost rushing past it. It's almost like, well, actually, you're better off without that person because they're not in pain. And it just feels a bit like, I've heard that before, not to myself, but I've definitely heard someone say that to someone.
And I think, this might be something that the bereaved person chooses to say if they have spent hours with somebody who has been struggling. But it's their grief and their bereavement, not ours. And in fact, the just need to let go is completely contrary to one of the major current bereavement theories. It used to be that it was thought that the final part of grieving was to let go of somebody and move on to new things. And we now know that doesn't happen. We maintain a relationship with the person that's died, but it's a changed relationship. So for some people, that's going to the grave and having a little chat every day to give them the news.
Yeah.
For other people, it may be just having a photograph and a candle at home where they just remember somebody specially. For more people, it's probably having a sort of reference person in one's head when it comes to major decisions. And you think, now, what would Jim have said?
Yeah.
And because you've known Jim for so long, you know exactly what Jim would have said. And it actually automatically forms part of one's decision-making process. Or it might be, actually, I want to make somebody proud of me.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I agree with you. I think the idea of letting go in the first place is kind of strange, because it's kind of a nice concept to think that that person still exists within you, because you think of them often and you think of those decisions, those hard to make decisions. I generally think that is a lovely way to think. I think people would be better thinking that they're still.
But it's relatively new. It's only in the last 20, 30 years that some of these things have been examined, and that's actually been sort of recognized as being right and normal.
Absolutely. And it's not just the use of language. It's actually these are more wholesale common mistakes, I guess you could say, in organizations in general. Not just organizations, but in life. But these tend to crop up in organizations a lot, making promises you can't keep, making comparisons with others in times of grief. We talked a bit about that, assumptions, projections, rushing colleagues back to work, ignoring the grief in general, and then lack of communication. Are there any here you'd like to pick out, Anne, and explain why they're so bad?
Well, no, I think they're all right. What I would say is that some people will want to come back to work, and at the end of the day, there is a need for continuity of service. So there may be discussions to be had, but people may need time off at other times, which is still really bereavement related. So, for example, they may need time off during the day to make those phone calls that can only be made during office hours for people who work sort of traditional 9 to 5. You can normally only get hold of a solicitor during those hours, or a coroner's officer, or the registrar. The same with going to see the funeral director. Obviously, there's the funeral itself, and people may need time to travel for that. The other thing is that if there's to be an inquest, then that, by its very nature, because it's examining the circumstances of the death, takes people back to day one in time in terms of the evidence, and therefore, and an inquest may not happen for several weeks, months, or even a couple of years. So people will need time for that. I know of somebody who now teaches about grief who said, I needed time off exactly a year after his daughter had died, and he was very grateful for his GP, who wrote grief on his, I think it might still have been a sick certificate as opposed to a fit note then, but whichever, that was still the reason. That's when suddenly he found he couldn't go on without some time away.
Yeah. And Evie, looking at it from a different perspective, what kind of effect can these all have on an organization's culture and well-being as a collective? What sort of effect do these have?
I think quite a lot.
Yeah.
So the one that actually out of these ones that points out to me is specifically lack of communication.
Yeah.
I think, as we discussed like throughout already, like lack of communication can have a wide impact on isolation through grief. It can then cause potential like misunderstandings. Yeah, you might not necessarily be able to figure out like the needs of that individual person, as Anne was talking about just now as well. And overall, I think reduced engagement, like that would have a huge impact if knowing you don't have the support or backing from your workplace and organization can have such a negative impact on your perception of where you're currently working, for sure.
Yeah, you're right as well, because having that lack of communication at a really important time in a colleague or employee's life, actually it's like a deep-rooted problem of maybe there's a lack of communication in other well-being areas.
Yeah, exactly. Most likely is.
Yeah, and actually practicing an open communication would help in loads of other areas as well when it comes to well-being. Would you sort of agree with that?
No, definitely, 100%. I think communication is the source of everything, isn't it? If you don't have communication within your like organization, or don't feel like you can communicate or say things, then yeah, that's when people bottle it up, and then that's when it gets worse. So
yeah, absolutely. So why is talking about death so difficult? Why is it taboo? I think because everyone deals with grief differently is a good sort of headline, I guess. And if you were to delve deeper, I was wondering if you talk us through the range of emotions that people might experience when it comes to bereavement, and how do they change over time?
Well, I think, as I said, most people are fairly shocked at the beginning or surprised. Even if the death is expected, when it actually happens, people will often still say they feel quite shocked. And there often is a period of numbness. And the way I've just described that, actually, I sent a message to somebody, saw on Facebook that her father had died, and she said, oh, we're all just numb at the moment. And I said, that's normal. That's your body and your mind protecting you from feeling completely overwhelmed by all of the pain all at once. We've talked about guilt. You know, oh, the one day I didn't kiss him goodbye as he went off to work this morning. Or, oh, we'd had a stupid argument last night and we hadn't made it up this morning. Those sorts of things take on a disproportionate significance. And particularly with children, actually, if they've been a bit naughty, well, maybe Mum has died because she was cross with me and it's my fault because I was naughty and she didn't love me anymore. Children think very literally for it's called magical thinking, and for some of their younger childhood, that can be a real danger. So there's guilt. We've mentioned anger. And sometimes people have every reason to be angry about what's happened. And one of the things is that I think perhaps doesn't get enough attention is what you do about all the questions that can no longer be answered. You know, the loss of future things that can no longer happen. Now, that might be a father walking his daughter down the aisle at a wedding, or it might be why he walked out on their mother and children at some point in the past. So the opportunity for answered questions and sometimes for apologies is lost forever.
Those resolutions are sort of have disappeared, which can I can imagine make things very frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is people often are in a state where it's very difficult to distinguish between clinical depression and grief because they are just so tired. Grief is utterly exhausting. And we know as well that it actually impacts on our immune system. So there are physical effects of grief. We know that people have reduced immunity to infection after the death of somebody close to them. And one of the very famous early studies that was done in this country by a psychiatrist called Colin Murray Parkes, who has only just died in his mid-90s, an amazing man who did so much around grief care in this country. But he found that particularly with men, a very great many of them would die within 2 years of their wife dying.
Yeah.
It was a study that particularly looked at that sort of gender mix, but yeah, it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, we might actually be seeing them again fairly soon as a patient. And I certainly have experienced that when I was working in the NHS, that the two deaths would often be very close together. And it's almost like one person just doesn't have the incentive to go on, which can be very difficult for the next generation down, who, you know, well, mum's just died and now dad's gone as well, and we needed him around a bit longer. And it feels to the next generation that, oh, well, mum was more important to us than we are. Which actually, to be honest, the commitment was to the marriage before they ever had children. So there is some sense to that. It's recognised in a traditional wedding service, till death do us part. So yeah, there's a huge range. And the other thing, the timescales are different. So within a family, that can cause distress. If one person's down while another person's coping, or somebody goes into practical mode while somebody's more emotional, then they're not being very sympathetic, or she just sits around crying all day. Why won't she get on and do something? You can see that those dynamics can cause real difficulties.
Yeah, no, I can understand that as well. The timelines are off for every person within a family, I imagine, because someone does sort of fit the practical mode, whereas one may be a bit more apathetic or numb. And then you experience that sort of heartache later, that sort of that really dwelled sort of feeling of grief and feeling vulnerable. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that the time frame might change. It's not those initial 2 weeks, is it? It's actually maybe waiting for that to happen over the course of 6 months to a year, maybe.
Yeah, and I think, within a work situation, it then, the result of that is that somebody, an appropriate level of management, whatever, just checks in every now and again, not to go overboard and make somebody feel picked on, but just to say, oh, how are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Keep up that conversation rather than it just being a one-stop shop. Open communication lasts a bit longer, doesn't it? But what should we say? We talked about what not to do. We've talked about what not to say, the common mistakes, the flaws, the pitfalls. But what should we be saying? And I think you touched on it earlier when you just went, "I'm sorry." It's very neutral. You're showing that bit of emotion towards them, but you're not going overboard and saying it's an assumption or prediction or anything like that. It does start with something neutral, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think all of those are good because they're questions that give somebody the opportunity to, would you like to talk about it? Actually, not right now.
Yeah.
But what you've expressed is that there will be an opportunity to talk about it. And, the response to that is that's okay. If you feel you want to talk at any stage, we're here for you. I think, is anything you need? I would want to sometimes suggest, could we put something concrete against that?
Yeah.
In terms of, do you have an idea yet when the funeral will be and that you'll need time off? Will you need are you having to have people to stay, or all those sorts of things? And I think this applies in our personal lives as well. If somebody says, oh, let me know if there's anything you need, we all say that, and people say, are they just being polite or did they mean it?
Yeah, did they just say it? Did they just
whereas if you say, particularly if somebody perhaps who's a non-car driver, or it just wouldn't be a good idea for them to be driving right now because of their distress, do you need a lift anywhere?
Yeah.
Can I help you with some shopping? So I know of one workplace where a whole gang of guys, their colleague died, his wife had young children, and they just said, right, you don't ever need to worry about gardening. We will stop by on a regular basis and we will do the garden. And they also clubbed together to get some sports kit that the lad needed that otherwise she would have struggled to afford.
Yeah, I like that as well, because it's not necessarily saying anything that's just a small action that has a monumental effect on the way someone might be grieving. Actions do generally speak louder than words. So when you do say, is there anything you need? I guess it's good to think about what they might need rather than saying it. Yeah, I think that's really wise. That's a nice place.
Can I just, sorry, before we just go on, can I
go on.
Just say, obviously, this death may affect other people in the workplace other than the primary bereaved person.
Of course, like the death of someone within the workplace.
Particularly if it's somebody within the workplace has died, or it's a small community where everybody knows everyone else. So, it may be necessary to give some thought to, can we close that section down for an afternoon? Asking the primary bereaved person, would colleagues be welcome at the funeral, for example? And then maybe arranging a minibus or those sorts of things that enable colleagues to express their support and their grief in a way that is concrete. Now, it's not going to be possible everywhere. It's not going to be relevant everywhere, but one does need to bear those things in mind as well.
Yeah, I was at a previous employment. A colleague of mine passed away, and the organisation didn't know how to deal with it at all. Obviously, because it was unexpected. But how should they? Should they have gathered that group of? Should they gather the entire organisation together and sort of had an open conversation about it? Like what action should they have taken at the time?
My feeling is, obviously it's going to depend on the organisation. If you've got multiple sites, it's not going to impact everybody. But I would say that how it's communicated with the immediate team, bearing in people might be on maternity leave, on holiday and miss out, that gathering that team together and saying, look, guys, I'm really sorry. some of you will have heard the news, some of you may not, but to get a kind of proper version of what's happened.
Yeah.
So to get up-to-date information, so if it's a road traffic collision, to get accurate information from the family as they've received it from the police, to stop unhelpful rumours. And then just to say, look, we realise everybody's going to be struggling over the next few days. If somebody needs a bit of time out, then, you know, we'll work that out for you.
Acknowledgement again.
Again, acknowledgement. But Evie may have a kind of more HR perspective on that and the practicalities of a workplace.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what we were going to move on to next, because I think when it comes to that sort of practicality and even emotional practicality as well, Evie, can you give me any examples of emotional ways HR teams or managers should react to bereavement?
Yeah, as I said, managers as well, because very much same for both of them. But I think essentially things we've just discussed really around the importance of like communication, give time to speak to that employee. I guess also establish whether that employee in itself like wanted other people to know about like that loss. Yeah, and also another thing is, again, whether this is something the employee wants, is that once they're back in work, is about having like potential regular check-ins when the person is back in the workplace to see how they're doing, because it is very much a continuation, isn't it? So yeah, I'd say for that one for sure.
Yeah, and because it seems like there's two different phases, doesn't it? There seems like that initial emotional support that colleagues, HR teams can give, and then what are the proactive forms of support, the more tangible ones that HR teams, managers can give?
Yeah, definitely. So the first one here, as you can see, is be flexible. I think this is around like workload, it could be around shift patterns. So essentially just they might need, I guess, like a lighter workload. They may need to work, yeah, as I said, like different hours or different shifts, or even take potentially like a slightly different role, like entirely. Because overall this can then help reduce stress, and also I guess if they've got, as Anne said, any practical matters that they need to be doing or taking an hour out of their day or phone calls, then that can support them in doing that without thinking, oh, I've got this to do, I've got these meetings, and it's just an extra thing they don't have to have on top of their plate as well. And yeah, just overall then that whole piece to consider is like once they're back to work, it doesn't mean that anything has necessarily changed, because there's loads of different phases. As Anne says, it's not just something that, oh, they're grieving and then that is it for a month. It's a continuation and it can come back in different forms. People could be reminded by different smells, different things that has come up in their day, and it can affect that day quite seriously, even if it's years down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. What sort of when should one stop offering their own emotional support and start signposting? When should that, and how important is that happening for like external support to come in?
Shall I start on that one?
Yeah,
I think,
course, yeah.
I think we know that counselling in the traditional sense in the early stages after a death is not going to be especially helpful.
Yeah.
Being listened to will. And obviously a lot of places will have their own employee assistance programs, which can be used for an initial period of listening. Some people will need very specific support at some point, but that works best when people opt into it themselves. What we sometimes find is people call us at National Bereavement Service and say, oh, somebody at work says I need to ring you to get counselling because I burst into tears today at work. And it's only 3 months since somebody's died. Well, for goodness sake, actually, what we will do is we'll have a conversation that's a bit like a triage conversation and say, oh, you sound very normal to me. Maybe you need to take a few extra loo breaks if you suddenly feel yourself welling up and need to get away from your desk for a little while. But there is an awful lot of external support available. Some of it's from peer groups. So particularly if somebody has experienced the death of someone due to a road traffic collision or suicide or homicide, there are very specific groups that can provide support. The same with, there's an excellent organisation called Widowed and Young for anybody under 50. And that provides both social and emotional support and practical support in terms of information. And it's just brilliant. And it was started by bereaved people. And that's when it says widowed and young, that is of any partnership style relationship. It doesn't have to be people who've taken marriage vows or civil partnership vows. So there is an awful lot out there. One of the things that we specifically do is to actually talk with people around the sort of support they need and signpost them. We'll look for something also in their area as well as national organisations. The other thing is people often need support with the practical things, which is really our core territory at National Bereavement Service. And it's entirely free for people to ring us. We even have a template bereavement policy that we will share with people if that's helpful.
I assume that would be incredibly helpful. I imagine people on this webinar as well will be looking into that for sure.
And I was just going to say, sorry, from an HR perspective, it's important to be able to signpost these as well. So everything you just mentioned, and you don't want to make it harder for an individual to be able to find this information. So if you've got a page, or I guess it's going on to what we're doing later, like a bereavement policy, but I think there's like 30% of those in employment say that they've actually shared like actual things and policies within the past year. So people actually don't know where this information is if they're looking for it. So as an organisation, you can then facilitate those conversations. I think it obviously takes it back to like offering genuine support. As business leaders, HRs and managers, it's important for you to play that role in encouraging these conversations around grief in the workplace, normalising them, and also, raising awareness for the resources that are available to staff internally, but also externally if they want that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, Evie.
I was going to continue on this slide, Robin.
Yes, please.
I think one of the other things on here that I did want to mention is run employee surveys. So I think that's quite an interesting one, and one people don't necessarily tend to think about. It obviously goes around the whole engagement piece, but it's not asking those that are bereaved like questions. Like, it's nothing to do with that. It's essentially around what policies should we have in place, and like using their voice to feel like if something was to happen, preventative, I guess, do they feel supported and they know where to find the information they're looking for? So using them, you will know your employees as much as anybody else will. So use them as much as possible if you're looking at where do I start with this whole bereavement policy or everything to do with bereavement or anything else within the workplace. Get that from their voices, set it up, and then they'll feel acknowledged, and then it creates an overall better working culture as well.
Yeah, and again, that starts with listening as well, which we've talked about so much, rather than assuming what people want and projecting what people might feel. It all starts with listening to the employees, even those that haven't experienced bereavement or grief, and just listening to them and what they would find most applicable, even if they don't know yet. It's just still that opening conversation, listening and getting it out there is really important.
Yeah, which is so important. And then I guess the final piece on this, obviously there's other bits, but one of the ones is like building a comprehensive bereavement policy. So we actually saw that Hospice UK shared a report that it was 56% of people would consider leaving their employer if they didn't provide proper bereavement support. So I think that in itself is quite a large number of people would think, actually, if I don't feel supported, I'm not going to be staying here. So
yeah, I'm not amazing at maths, but that seems like a majority. And I assume that percentage might be 100 if those other, 44% of people had experienced bereavement.
Can I chip in with something else, Robin, please?
Absolutely.
One thing we haven't put on this slide is training.
Yeah.
an awful lot of workplaces have staff members who deal with bereaved people on behalf of the organisation. Most financial organisations or caring organisations will have people who regularly deal with bereaved people ringing up to notify of a death, to end an account, or the death of a resident in a care home. So actually, having those staff who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, it's important that they receive appropriate training. But even for in-house managers and HR teams, and also mental health first aiders. Mental health first aiders are a great resource, and one of the things that we've done recently is quite a bit of training, additional training for mental health first aiders around bereavement, so that they feel equipped to support colleagues. And that's an important extra resource that one can have in-house.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That comes from the workforce directly as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's something else that, you know, takes expertise to train in, but then comes from the company culture. So that is very important.
Yeah.
And it's been alluded to, but what does the best bereavement policy look like? And I know someone did ask a question earlier, Anne, about if you could send that template, and I'm sure you'll be sending that. We'll be happy to share that template with people afterwards.
What I've suggested is people contact us directly via the form on our website, because then we can have individual conversations as to what's appropriate, because the template is much longer than most people will need, because I've tried to cover every possible scenario within it.
That's hard, isn't it? That's very
so it will be much longer than people actually want. So one of the things we do, both with training and we can do it with that, is to look at what is applicable to this particular work scenario, because they're all so different.
Yes. What we'll do then is that we'll put all the details of after this, we'll send an email out to everyone that's attending today and say, if you'd like to find out more, contact X, you can find it here, and put links for everyone to find it afterwards. Just all those resources and signposts. But in conscious of time, we've only got a few minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions to answer.
I'm typing answers as we speak.
Oh, Anne, you're a whiz. You're an absolute whiz. What I was just going to touch on, Anne, if you're not too busy typing, is what does the best bereavement policy look like to you?
I think the flexibility, manager discretion, is really important. So, this one's for you, Robin, and you, Evie, on terms of that next question. It is around the communication. It's giving people a structure of things to follow, but also to give them the tools. So to have your bereavement policy in a format that you can share it with the bereaved employee. So there's a kind of toolkit, a template letter, for example.
Yeah.
Information booklets for people about what has to be done after a death.
Absolutely.
So it's not just the policy, it's part of a sort of little package that a manager can pull out and say, oh, I've just been told somebody's died, and they can just do a quick refresh of what they need to be doing.
Yeah, and that's a weight lifted off their shoulders, because we're not expected to know everything and know exactly what to do when hearing this. It is shocking. So having that as a safety blanket, as a go-to, is so important, and that can be a part of your bereavement policy moving forward.
Yeah.
And have that sort of the best sort of starter toolkits, the do's, the don'ts, all that sort of stuff to add and include. Evie, how can a better bereavement policy improve company culture, retention, and recruitment for organisations?
I can't actually multitask, so I was typing something out, but Anne is
Only
completely
Anne can
different
do that.
human.
Only Anne can do that.
Only Anne can do it. Well, I think we've just highlighted like quite a few different areas why, like how to preach like grief at work, isn't it? So I think companies often will fall short because of discussing topics like death, I think, can be a taboo, or things that people don't tend to want, because it's uncomfortable, isn't it? So people don't want to go down that path. But I think actually making some small changes towards actually communicating with like agreed members, or like any team members, if it's like wider group, can actually set your company probably quite apart from the rest, and obviously creates that great working culture, and can really have an improvement on morale and a lot of different positive effects. But I think putting your energy into your strategies around like this experience and everything that you've like, I guess, potentially learned today, can have like a good impact on the rest of your team too.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And that brings us quite nicely to the questions. I mean, like Anne, we've already been answering the questions. So, I mean, I couldn't possibly type and talk at the same time. I can barely talk and talk at the same time. But thank you so much for those that asked questions. I wasn't expecting loads because it's a very sensitive subject, but thank you, Anne, for answering them. Well, someone did ask if they could have the template bereavement, but like you said, you've answered by getting contact, and then you can discuss the sort of the nuances of your exact what your organization needs and sort of looks like. But there was also a question on, hi, this has been great. Do you have any more webinars coming up around this topic or wider employee benefits? We always have more webinars coming up. What they're on is very diverse. We're always looking at the sort of niches and the nuances of later living. But we've got one next month on the Carers Leave Act. And that's really important because that's very timely. So tune in for that. But we will have lots more on later living. And speaking about that, I just want to thank Anne from the National Bereavement Service for joining us, because her expertise is invaluable.
Right. Can I just very quickly say on the questions that we've got in sitting there?
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Have we seen an improvement in labour turnover following implementing a bereavement policy? Chloe, I'm not sure if you're actually asking that or whether you're saying that you have seen it, but the research would suggest that that is the case. I think the end of life phase, anonymous attendees asked, yes, that's something, again, we've got information on our website around that, and a lot of the same things would apply. But that sits also very much within carers as well. Charlie, yeah, get in touch with us. We'll see what we can do to help.
Yeah, Charlie, just because people can't see these questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Right. Okay. Right. Charlie's asked about creating a pitch for a CEO to increase bereavement leave. So yeah, get in touch with us at MBS and we'll see what we can do. Somebody's asked about the phase when before somebody dies. Yeah, we can give you some help around that. And actually, somebody's talked about the help of colleagues and with alleviating workload. That's David. Thank you. And yeah, colleagues who just pitch in and just say, "Oh, I've got some free time. Can I help with any of the projects you've got on?" That's immensely helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you for all those questions. I honestly didn't anticipate loads, but it's nice that this has been so valuable. I recognize that we're at midday and lots of you have to jump off and go elsewhere. But again, I don't know if someone... thank you. Eleanor's just said this has been really helpful. Thanks all. And that goes nicely with me thanking Evie from Seniorcare by Lottie, and Anne from the National Bereavement Service. Seniorcare by Lottie partner with National Bereavement Service and Adroit Legal for all later living processes. So do get in contact with us if you would like to learn more about elderly care or later living. And of course, we're going to put in all sorts of links to put you in contact with Anne and the National Bereavement Service, or Anne Adroit themselves for later living, power of attorney, will writing. All these things are super important, and it's important that we broach the subject instead of brushing them under the proverbial carpet. Do we all agree with that?
Yes.
There
I'm
are more.
answering more questions.
There are more questions coming in. Yes. Thank you so much. Should we answer them? Should we answer them?
The one that was a question, it was around if somebody's already a coma and lasting power of attorney. It's a different process when somebody's already in a coma, but contact MBS and we can give you advice on that.
Okay, brilliant.
There's also a survey that will be sent across to people once you leave. You'll have a new pop-up. So if you could fill that out, that would be brilliant. It'd be really useful to get any feedback from you.
Definitely.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining, because this is super important and we really appreciate it. And yes, if you do have time to fill out a quick survey, again, that would be great. And if you do have a question that hasn't been answered here, don't be afraid to email us and ask us, because we'll be happy to respond. Unfortunately, we've got so much to talk about and we've already gone slightly over time, but please ask away, because we'll be more than happy to help. Thanks again to Anne. Thanks again to Evie. And I hope everyone here has a lovely day. And yes, this is being recorded and we'll send that to everyone after this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.